Yeah, to begin with, like Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is one of the most important figures in Indian history. And what inspired you to study his life and work, and what do you find most compelling about his legacy?
Well, I learned about Baba Sahib Ambedkar in kind of an accidental fashion. I was told when I was a grad student writing on John Dewey that there was a student of Dewey's named Ambedkar in India, and I kind of brushed it aside. And then 10 years later, when I should have been doing another project, I looked into this Ambedkar fellow, and I found a fascinating story waiting to be told. I just fell in love with this narrative that was there, that he was drawing upon and changing and adding to and altering what we think we mean by pragmatism. So he had an engaged philosophy like Dewey always wanted. John Dewey was one of his teachers, but it was oriented towards the context of India and social justice and its problems in India.
What lessons the West should learn from Dr. Ambedkar philosophy, as in the recent times, his thoughts and ideas are being precipitating into the West?
The West should learn a lot of lessons from Ambedkar, and I think Bhimrao Ambedkar should be taught in many more of our classes, but because he's a thinker. He's not just a doer, he's not just an activist, he's not just a politician, he's also a theorist. And I can consider him one of the premier theorists of democracy. And one of the things the West can learn from Baba Sahib Ambedkar is the idea that democracy involves balances and trade-offs. Democracy is not just about happily and silently staring at each other. Democracy is about arguing. Democracy is about resolving differences. Democracy is about changing your opinions. And sometimes democracy is about losing political battles without losing everything. So how do we make community in these conditions? How do we form communities even with people we rabidly disagree with, our political partisan opponents? So Baba Sahib can teach the West and also just the world this idea of democracy as a balance between three values, as he puts it: equality of all people, liberty and freedom of all people, and fraternity or fellow feeling. And that's easier said than done, of course. You can always give everyone equality, but sacrifice fellow feeling. So how do you achieve all of these things in a community that's one unity? That's a challenge that he gives us.
Dr. Ambedkar was not only a political leader and thinker, but also a deeply spiritual person, and he studied Buddhism, and he sought to reform the social scape of this nation. His ideas also, as you previously highlighted, on religion differed from Dewey. So, can you speak on the relationship between Ambedkar's political and spiritual beliefs and how they informed each other?
Yes, Ambedkar is known by many as a Buddhist thinker, but of course, when he started out, Buddhism was not at the forefront of his public rhetoric, his writings, his speeches, etc. But this is one thing I've noticed in my own work and my recent book, the idea that Ambedkar builds upon his beloved teacher John Dewey. And whereas John Dewey gave up on religion in many senses, at least organized religion, Bhimrao Ambedkar saw a great hope for religion. If we can get the right religion that valued rationality, enabled reflective individuals to criticize and reform even that religious tradition, you could get a religion that helps democracy and doesn't hold it back. So all that stuff Ambedkar said about democracy in these early days, especially the idea of democracy as involving habits, attitudes that we take towards each other, and the ways that we try to get equality, liberty, and fraternity, those things all get a new vocabulary put upon them in his final years when he starts talking more and more as a Buddhist. So his idea of spirituality is not otherworldly. What fascinates me is his idea of spirituality and religion is this worldly. The idea is, how do we create democracy through things like Buddhism?
Dr. Ambedkar was a prolific speaker and debater. He also talked about the significance of public speaking in most of his speeches. If you could have him debate anyone from history, who would it be? A philosopher? Who would it be, and what would be the topic?
This is a challenging question, because I'm tempted to say Plato or Manu, because these are philosophers that put divisions in society at the forefront of some of their writings. But my final answer would probably be Dewey. Because one of the things that I really realized when I started studying Bimrao Ambedkar in the context of his relationship to his teacher, John Dewey, is that when we're influenced by someone, when someone makes a difference to us, it's not a mere copying. Sometimes it's they put forward ideas and problematics that we say are just not the most useful or the most right way of putting those things. And so we resist those kinds of ways of doing this. So in many ways, I'd be really intrigued to hear what Bimrao Ambedkar would say to his beloved teacher, especially if he felt open enough to disagree with his teacher, and how he would push against Dewey's pragmatism. In my own work, I've seen some ways that his pragmatism differs from Dewey's. He takes these values of liberty, equality, fraternity, and runs with them in ways that Dewey never saw possible. He sees the problematics of caste in terms of its damage to the democratic community in ways that Dewey never saw. So Ambedkar, as a philosopher of democracy, has some of the same goals as Dewey, but he senses different problems, and he sees different ways of getting there. For instance, Ambedkar himself thought that individuals who communicate and who persuade, and maybe even individuals who put forward some kind of religion like the Buddhism he proffers, could make a difference in the struggle for democracy. So it'd be interesting to see Dewey and Ambedkar have a respectful but engaged debate.
In addition to this, would you help us understand, Dr. Ambedkar's critique on Dewey's pragmatism?
First of all, when you think of what it means to be a pragmatist, it's never unity or homogeneity. So the people we identify in American philosophy as pragmatists, William James, Charles Saunders Peirce, John Dewey, Jane Addams, they obviously, if you look at their work, they have radical differences. They disagree with each other. Sometimes they complain about the thought of the other person. So, there's a sense where we have to figure out what we mean when we say someone's a pragmatist. When I say someone's a pragmatist, I have two levels of meaning here. One, there's a sense where a historical linkage is established. The idea that someone read or heard someone else and is somehow influenced by that thinker's thought. There's another sense where all the pragmatists seem to share an interest, if not a common philosophy, but an interest in topics like experience and the role of philosophy as improving lived experience. And things like science become valorized. So you get this kind of rich notion of pragmatism that doesn't reduce people to each other. Now, when it comes to Ambedkar, how did he differ from Dewey's pragmatism, or how did he resist parts of it? Well, I think the answer there is interesting but complex. There's some things he saw that were interesting in Dewey's thought that Dewey didn't even subscribe to anymore when Ambedkar had him as a teacher. So Ambedkar picked and chose what he was interested in Dewey's thought, and some of those things he picked because he wanted to resist them. And one of the things he really strongly resisted was Dewey's urge to say the individual is composed by the society surrounding that individual. For Ambedkar, that'd never do, because he was interested in critiquing a millennia-old society and a group with customs that put him in a caste hierarchy. So Ambedkar, one of the improvements Ambedkar makes is the idea that dialectic is true. The individual depends on the group composes the individuals. But at some special moments, that individual can affect or maybe even reform or change the group.
Dr. Ambedkar's speeches and writing are often seen as examples of powerful and persuasive rhetoric. What do you see as the key rhetorical strategies that he employed, and how might these strategies be applied in contemporary public discourse?
Ambedkar clearly was a great communicator. And when we use the word rhetoric, we mean the art of persuasion. And I think Ambedkar highly respected the art of rhetoric. And when he spoke, he was able to captivate the attention of tens of thousands of audience members at his conferences. And oftentimes, these were audience members that were not immersed in philosophy. They were not literate. But he was able to captivate them with his ideas. Now, how? How did he do that? Well, one thing that I think of when I think of rhetoric is that how do we define this? We think of rhetoric involves adjusting ideas to your audience, so your audience understands them. but doing this with a purpose to adjust your audience to your ideas. Because you're not just flattering the audience, telling them what they want to hear. In many cases, you're trying to move the audience, change the audience, persuade the audience. So Ambedkar very much was a master of that sense of rhetoric. When he gave speeches to Dalit audiences who were feeling the crush of caste oppression, he did a great job trying to adapt Buddhism to be a philosophy, a religious outlook that could help them gain self-respect and then demand respect from others. When he was talking to international Buddhists, people who were committed to Buddhism but might be more interested in meditation, let's say, or nirvana than in social justice, he was able to adapt and change his vision of Buddhism such that he could persuade them not necessarily to care about caste, but to care about Buddhism as an engaged global social philosophy. So he was a master at adjusting his ideas to his audience, all in the quest of adjusting his audience to his ideas.
Dr. Ambedkar wrote extensively on the importance of education. He briefly thought at some places, if he were a teacher today, what subject do you think he would teach, and what kind of student feedback do you think he would give?
Yeah, thinking about Ambedkar as a teacher. Now, Ambedkar was a teacher at the beginning of his career, and I think he sensed that he could do more good for him and his people in political activism. But if he was a teacher today, this is an interesting question to consider. He would clearly challenge his students, and I think Ambedkar would be, like Dewey, challenging his students to go out into the world, to do more than just that within the confines of the classroom. So this is one hallmark of education in the modern era, the idea that we want to learn by doing. But there's an extra step I think Ambedkar would add, and probably we'd call this a hallmark of his pragmatism, the idea that philosophy should return to the world. And when he's teaching in the class, he's teaching his philosophy or certain skills of critical thinking. I think he would really emphasize to his students to go beyond, book learning, go beyond exams. So I have a feeling Ambedkar would be one of those teachers that would send his students to serve at the soup kitchen to learn about charity versus just learn about theories of being kind to your fellow human. So I really think he probably would instantiate, maybe in ways better than his teacher John Dewey did, the idea of learning by doing.
Could you help us draw parallels between Ambedkar's Navayana with the pragmatism in the West?
Yes, this is the subject of my recent book, The Evolution of Pragmatism in India. But the idea is intriguing. The idea that Ambedkar says he was respectful and he owed a lot to his teacher John Dewey, and then he develops this sort of mix of democracy and Buddhism, especially in his later years, right before he died, that's so different from Dewey. So this is an open question. How did these two relate to each other? How did their thought cross-pollinate, and how did Ambedkar synthesize things he learned in his expansive education? So when you consider the question of how does Navayana or New Vehicle Buddhism in Ambedkar relate or differ from pragmatism, what you see is the commonalities of democracy are still there, but the means of religion, the kind of emphasis on religion as a way that I can train myself to see my fellow human as equal to me and as someone I should respect, even if I disagree with them, even if they beat me at political debates, even if I win at political debates. See them as a person worthy of respect. That's really an advance, I think, in the pragmatist tradition. So I don't like to think of Ambedkar as copying Dewey. I don't like to think of Ambedkar as better than Dewey or different from Dewey. I like to think of Ambedkar as another evolution. Pragmatism goes to China and becomes and flowers different things. Pragmatism goes to India in the form of Bhimrao Ambedkar. And in his work on the Constitution, in his work on revisioning Buddhism, pragmatism flowers into a whole different species, so to speak.
So can we say this Ambedkar's synthesis of democracy and Buddhism is, a new addition or his contribution to the pragmatist school of thought?
Yes, Ambedkar's synthesis between Buddhism and democracy is absolutely unique. Dewey gave up on religion early on. One of his students, as a matter of fact, I've came across a reflection, and the student says, Dewey said you could either have dogmatism or free thinking, and religion is just too closely connected to dogmatism. So Dewey seemed to, in his person in his later years and also in his philosophy, give up hope that religion could really be something that freed our mental habits and freed us from concretized ways, set ways of seeing other people that just weren't working anymore. He gave up on religion as solving all that. But Ambedkar had a faith in democracy, but he also had a faith in the right sort of religion. So he said, if we could find the right sort of religion that gives us kind of flexible principles that kind of let us meet a changing circumstance, whether it's India in the 1950s or perhaps America today with TikTok and Facebook. If we can find the right sort of religion or philosophy, we can adapt and deal with that kind of situation. So Ambedkar's solution is ingenious. The idea is, how do we find guides that are halfway flexible, that help us deal with a changing environment without kind of falling into a new trap of being sedimented in our ways? So like Dewey, he prizes flexibility, but unlike Dewey, he really runs with religion as a source of flexibility.
You have been here for a week, and I see you have been also a part of the Ambedkar Jayanti, Bhim Jayanti. What is your experience? What is your takeaway?
Well, one of the things I realized when I was writing my book and doing my research on Ambedkar and John Dewey, Ambedkar in many ways is, I count him as a philosopher. And if you count him as a philosopher, Ambedkar is absolutely unique in the Western or maybe even Eastern or Indian tradition. Why? Well, his philosophy is all built on this kind of version and vision of pragmatism as letting the individual, using the right tools like religion or like organizing groups, letting the individual leverage and move and change that group. So the individual is not just beholden to the group. The individual is connected to the group, but the individual could at the right moment change that group or form that group. So Ambedkar's philosophy is all about reforming the group and improving how the group and the individual interact, how the individual's valued in that group. But what's beautiful about Ambedkar's philosophy and what you see on Jayanti, right, and what you see on moments of conversion to Buddhism, including Ambedkar's own, is that the individual action can meet with that philosophy. So when Ambedkar in October of 1956 stands on that stage in Nagpur and adopts Buddhism, he's not just joining a faith, he's enacting something he has written about in his philosophy. So I find that absolutely unique, the idea that someone can philosophize an idea of reconstruction of self and reconstruction of society, and then create a diksha, a conversion ceremony, where he takes some steps towards reconstructing his self and maybe his society. And I think that's a beautiful thing about Ambedkar's philosophy. I think he also realized that regardless of how other people respect you or disrespect you, if you don't respect yourself, they're not going to respect you. So the idea of conversion gets you at the minimum, and it's quite a maximum, the idea that you have self-respect and you respect yourself. And then you can start demanding respect from others. So in many ways, Jayanti celebrates this and enacts this kind of demand of self-respect and respect from others.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you.